Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We are currently playing a pre-event slideshow. Black text on a white background reads, "Live from NYPL and the Brennan Center for Justice present, After the Insurrection, How to Build a More Resilient Democracy," featuring Preet Bharara, Michael Steele, Michael Waldman, and Todd Whitman. Moderated by Nia-Malika Henderson. February 18th, 2021, 1 p.m. EST. Logos for Live from NYPL and the Brennan Center for Justice, NYU Law, appear in the corner of the slide. The next slide contains recommended reading. There are images of 4 suggested books: Doing Justice by Preet Bharara, It's My Party Too by Todd Whitman, The Fight to Vote by Michael Waldman, and Politics and the English Language by George Orwell. Check out the full list and reserve these books by visiting tonight's event page, nypl.org/live. The last slide lists Live from NYPL upcoming events. Thursday, February 18th, 8 p.m. EST. Racism's Hidden Costs, Heather McGee. Tuesday, February 23rd, 8 p.m. EST. The Harry Belafonte Black Liberation Speaker Series, Charles Blow with Hilton Als, co-presented by the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Thursday, February 25th, 8 p.m. EST. Writing Marvel's Black Panther, Sins of the King, featuring Stephen Barnes, Tananarive Due, Jeffrey Thorne, and Nick Stone. For more information and to register, visit nypl.org/live.
Hi, everyone. I'm Faye Rosenfeld, and I am the Vice President of Public Programs at the New York Public Library. We are so glad that you've joined us for today's program, After the Insurrection, How to Build a More Resilient Democracy. We are honored to be partnering this afternoon with the Brennan Center for Justice. The Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute affiliated with NYU School of Law, of which I just have to say I am very proud to be a graduate. In 2018, the Brennan Center created the National Task Force on Rule of Law and Democracy, a group of eminent cross-ideological and cross-partisan individuals with experience working in both Democratic and Republican administrations. The task force has published 2 reports setting out a legislative agenda to bolster democratic guardrails and unwritten rules that have traditionally checked abuses of power. We'll be hearing from some very prominent members of that task force in just a moment. Of course, commitment to democracy is also at the core of our work at the New York Public Library. It's our mission to ensure that everyone has access to books, information, and ideas, to all the essential knowledge that fuels human curiosity and creativity, builds strong and healthy communities, and helps foster an informed citizenry that is at the heart of a functioning democracy. So in that spirit, we are very excited to be joining with the Brennan Center to bring you this conversation that we know will educate and illuminate. And I want to thank Michael Waldman, Jean Park, and the entire Brennan Center team for working with the library to put this program together and really for everything that they do. I'm going to bring our panel on screen in just a minute, but before I do that, I have 2 very, very quick housekeeping notes. First, I invite you to share your questions for the panel. Type them into the Q&A box or into the YouTube chat if you're watching there, or you can email us your questions at publicprograms@nypl.org. We'll take as many as we can during the program. Second, live captions are provided via stream text. You can find the link to that in the email that you received when you signed up, as well as in the Zoom and YouTube chat. Now, please welcome our moderator, CNN senior political reporter, Nia-Malika Henderson.
It's so great to be here. Welcome to everyone. And we really want to just dive right in. The United States right now is emerging from unprecedented attacks on the rule of law and on its democratic institutions. This is a moment for renewal, and it's also a moment for reform. And the recent abuses of power point to the need to hold elected officials accountable to shore up institutional guardrails and also to revitalize our democracy. And before we dive right into this very important discussion, I'm going to introduce our distinguished guests. We've got Preet Bharara and Christine Todd Whitman are the co-chairs of the National Task Force on the Rule of Law and Democracy. And we're very grateful for their service to this very important project. Governor Whitman is the president of Whitman Strategy Group. She previously served as the administrator of the EPA and, of course, as governor of the great state of New Jersey. Preet Bharara is a distinguished scholar in residence, NYU School of Law, and host of the very popular podcast, Stay Tuned with Preet. He is the former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. Welcome, Christine. Welcome, Preet. We've also got Michael Steele, formerly, he was the chairman of the Republican National Committee, and he also served as the lieutenant governor of the great state of Maryland. And he is the host of the very popular podcast, Michael Steele Podcast. And listen, if you haven't seen Leslie Jones's tweets about Michael Steele, please Google them after we're all done here. Welcome, Michael Steele. And we've also got another Michael Waldman. He is the president of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law and the author of The Fight to Vote. Welcome, Michael. So welcome, everybody. And listen, I want Christine and Preet to weigh in on why make the case right now for institutional reform. We've got a new president. There's so much on his to-do list, right? You think about the pandemic, the health and economic crisis related to it. Why should democracy and the rule of law be on the top of this administration's agenda?
Well, Malika, as we've seen, even before January 6th, it was specifically the lack of trust in government that led to the instability that got us to where we are today. And that's why we need the guardrails that on the task force that Preet and I co-chaired, we set out a series of suggestions of actions that could be taken by the Congress in particular, but not just limited to the Congress, that would help solidify. It was really codifying behavior that we always considered normal. And that was blown away over the last 4 years. And if the public doesn't have a sense of trust in their government, if they don't have faith that they're getting the real story, that if they don't have faith that the people who represent them actually are representing them and not special interests, then it's going to be impossible to get us back on the same page and start addressing these issues. And that's why it becomes so important to put this at the forefront in order to enable us to get to the next step, to deal with this pandemic, to actually take the science seriously, to deal with the economic crisis. But if we don't have faith in government, and right now we don't, we need those guardrails to prove that, yes, people are acting in the best interest of the greatest number.
And Preet, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I agree with everything the governor said. Democracy is a conditioned precedent to all the other things, the policies we want, the rules we want, the goods and services we want from our government. If you don't have a properly functioning democracy where people trust and appreciate that the rule of law exists, that things are being done for the public welfare and not to punish political enemies or political adversaries, then I think you don't get anything done. This idea, if you think of the human body like the body politic, and you say, well, you have a lot of problems. I have migraines, I have foot sores, I have a cold, I have a fever, I have a temperature. All those things are important. But if you also know at the same time that your heart is at risk of stopping at any moment, you got to pay attention to the heart. And I feel like democracy obviously is the lifeblood of what we want as citizens. And if we don't fix those things,
keep using that word unprecedented. Can you give us some historical context for what we saw from the former president?
Well, in some ways, he was unprecedented. And in some ways, many of the things he did are akin to things other presidents have done. He took them to a sometimes more cartoonish extent. Other presidents have expanded their power. Other presidents have tried to use the presidency. The things that have been unprecedented with Donald Trump go to this very issue of the rule of law. an unprecedented refusal, for example, to abide by any oversight from Congress of the actions of the White House. And then I do think we all have to acknowledge that whatever one thinks about the other stuff that he may or may not have done in his presidency, the period after he lost the election, when he put forward, as we know, the big lie and persuaded tens of millions of people that the election had been stolen, and stoked a violent insurrection aimed at stopping the counting of the people's votes, that is unprecedented, certainly. So, when there has been past abuse, as the task force noted, that Governor Whitman and Preet Bharara co-chaired, when there's been past abuse, there is very often, not always, but very often, a response, a time for reform. And we believe we're at a moment just like that going forward.
In Michael Steele, we just saw the impeachment trial conclude in the Senate, no conviction there. What do you think about that? Was this a worthwhile effort for Democrats to undertake to impeach for a second time the former president? And where do Americans go from here in the wake of what we just saw?
Well, it may not have been worthwhile in the eyes and minds of a lot of folks out there because of the ultimate vote, but it was an important step, certainly because essentially, and especially because of what Preet put out there about democracy being the center, the most important part. It is the heart of how this great experiment of ours works. And when the heart is not cared for, if you do not apply the appropriate medicines at the right time, you're not going to heal. You're not going to begin to move yourself, physically, emotionally, mentally forward. And I think this effort by the Democratic House, the bipartisan effort, quite honestly, let's put it in the correct terms, to help heal the country was essential. It was important. I didn't like the outcome, but I appreciated and was grateful for the process playing out the way it did, because what it did for us, even though 43 members of my party thought and felt otherwise, what it did show was that this democracy is worth fighting for, and that we need to continue to make the case not just for its existence, but its relevance and importance going forward, and why everything that's come before, the warts, the ups, the downs, the slavery, the Jim Crow, the down economy, up economy, why all of that is part of the American narrative. And we grow and we learn and we move from that. We just don't stop existing because of that. We don't stop existing because Donald Trump did. And I think that that's an important lesson and message going forward for the country.
And Preet, one of the comments you heard after Trump was acquitted was that maybe there is some other form, right? Mitch McConnell said, maybe the courts would rule on this. It'd be some sort of criminal or civil charges. What's your sense of that? Is that a likelihood? Who should make those decisions? What do you think might happen with him facing any other consequences for what happened on January 6th?
Well, those are great questions. I don't know the answer to what the Justice Department will do, but as folks know, there are already in process investigations and both of the criminal nature and a civil nature with respect to President Trump's conduct in other areas. The Manhattan District Attorney has been taking a look at for quite some time the financial dealings of Donald Trump and his organization. Then more recently, you have people in Georgia looking at the issue of whether or not President Trump, when he was president during the transition, tried to change the election. You have then the issue of the insurrection. I guess that's sort of the more interesting and difficult question to answer. I think above all, the new Justice Department leadership, that's not yet there. Merrick Garland has a confirmation hearing coming up in a few days. They have to make a determination that, notwithstanding the fact that there was a Senate trial and there was an acquittal, although a bipartisan majority, but not enough, with 2/3 is what you need to convict in the Senate on impeachment, whether there is enough evidence to justify pursuing charges of insurrection as a federal criminal matter or seditious conspiracy or something else. I don't know what the answer to that will be. In my view, given what we've seen publicly, and given the powerful presentation made by the House managers about what Donald Trump said, about what he did, the context in which he said and did those things, his conduct after understanding what was happening at the Capitol, the reports that he was positively joyous that his supporters were doing something, he had to be cajoled into saying something about them leaving and disbanding. Depending on how you view the law, that's a powerful, I think, foundation for opening an investigation, not necessarily for charging, but for opening an investigation. Some of these arguments that Trump's impeachment lawyers made, I think, were preposterous and risible with respect to the First Amendment. Those are less preposterous arguments when you have to make out the elements of a crime against an individual, whether he's the president or not. So I'm glad I'm not the one making that decision. I think there's enough basis to open an investigation. Not clear whether or not there will ultimately be a prosecution with respect to insurrection.
What's your sense? There's the NAACP and that case with Benny Thompson bringing it against Donald Trump, as well as Rudy Giuliani as well. What do you make of that?
Oh, that me? I thought you were calling him Michael. Yeah, look, I think that's probably the beginning. Mm-hmm. I think there's lots of folks, criminal charges are one thing, and there are only a certain limited number of authorities, although there are many prosecutorial authorities in the country, DAs, U.S. attorneys, state attorneys general. But I think given the conduct of Donald Trump and given how much damage he's done, not just with respect to democracy, but other things that he's done in various ways, financial and otherwise, I haven't read it carefully and studied it deeply yet. And it's somewhat creative, and you don't see suits like that. I think you're going to see more of those. And I think, Donald Trump and his organizations are going to be in court a lot in the coming months and years.
And Christine, Todd, Whitman, we talk about accountability for the insurrection, about the DOJ, about these other cases that might be out there. What other guardrails also need to be strengthened going forward? You were an agency head. What do you see in terms of what the administration can do to prevent something like this going forward and to really strengthen a lot of the guardrails that frankly failed over the last 4 or 5 years?
Well, again, there's a lot in the report that we did that speaks directly to that. Things like ethics laws, in ensuring that they are very clearly written and that they are enforced, the ethics laws, ensuring that science is not compromised by politics. Policy, yes, that's always part of decision making, but not politics. And people have totally lost their confidence in the science and what they're hearing, other than Dr. Fauci. I think he's the only one that anybody trusts. They need to know that there are boundaries between how often and where and when an administration can insert themselves into a criminal case, into the Department of Justice. They need to feel that the rule of law means what we grew up thinking it meant, that justice is blind and that it's even-handed, and that justices and judges are not being appointed because of their political persuasion, but rather their ability to be impartial justices and to decide cases based on the facts before them. All those things have been undermined. And that's why we have made so many recommendations of tweaks that can be made. Some aren't big, but some are fairly substantial. And the good news is that there is a bipartisan bill in the House and in the Senate for the People Act, or I guess it's just in the House right now, the For the People Act. Mm-hmm. So that's bipartisan. People are taking it seriously, that there are these changes that can be made to reassure people that in fact those guardrails are important, those that they know are important are in place. There are things, again, as I said before, that we used to take for granted. Yeah. But unfortunately, we've seen that they can be too easily ignored and gotten away with. And of course, some of it has to go to Congress. Congress has got to strengthen its position as well. We've never seen a president, as Michael Waldman said, take such advantage of the power of the presidency and yet not be held accountable by the Congress at all.
And Michael Waldman, I wonder if you could talk about the state of our democracy and how it relates to the ongoing fights that we're seeing in states across the country over voting rights, over money in politics, over the idea of sort of fake news and the dissemination of misinformation. Put that all together for us if you can.
Well, it's exactly the right question to ask. The title of this event, which I love, After the Insurrection, begs a question, which is that in some senses we are not after the insurrection. The same big lie that drove those rioters, the idea that there's massive voter fraud, the idea that the election was rigged, that is articulated by far too many members of Congress, even to this day. And that is driving what's happening in 50 states, which is where much of the law of our democracy takes place. A wave of new proposed laws, for example, to restrict the vote in many states. We just saw in the last week in the state of Georgia, legislation introduced in the legislature there to repeal automatic voter registration, which Governor Kemp himself had put in place when he was Secretary of State, and to basically end vote by mail, which was such an extraordinary success nationwide during this election. So this is a fight that's going on now and going forward. One of the things that is so important, as Governor Whitman said, is those in power, those in office, need to understand the centrality of our democracy as a topic to address. You often will hear people say, "Oh, you know, the public doesn't really care about this stuff. It's technical. It's process." I think one thing we've learned is just how much so many people care, how much we need to care about the health of our democracy, and the fight for constitutional democracy has to be at the center of our politics.
But Michael Steele, I imagine when you think about the prospect of bipartisanship in this current environment, what we saw obviously from the insurrection, how your party voted, it's really easy to get discouraged. It's really easy to dismiss the idea that you're going to have enough people from both parties to pass any sort of legislation that might make it easier to vote. I mean, what do you say to people who are just discouraged because of what they see on Capitol Hill, Michael Steele?
Well, unfortunately, they have good reason to be. Our leaders have not given them any reason not to be. You have these bifurcated, trifurcated responses to very basic, simple questions like, "Do you uphold the Constitution?" You can't get a straight answer, and people are like, "Well, dude, I do. Why don't you?" Look, I love going back to what you said about the title of this program. After the insurrection. For me, the question is, then what? Then what? Or maybe worse, so what? Because we have to acknowledge we don't get better unless we want to get better. Going back to my first point, I don't get this strong yearning that we're really ready to press the case on accountability. Look at the fact that, between 2016 and 20, Donald Trump picked up almost 7 million additional voters than he had from 2016. So, 74 million people voted for something other than what Joe Biden was offering the country and in terms of solutions for COVID, et cetera. And a lot of it is the tribalism of politics. Really drives the narrative from policy to economy to healthcare, these host of issues, and so the question, the famous question, or statement, "Physician, heal thyself." Well, America, you got to heal yourself, but do you want to? And if you do, how do you intend to manifest that? So we can sit back and look at a particular leader, the president, or group of leaders, the Congress, the Senate, governors, and say, "All right, tell me what we're going to do. Make me feel better." Well, that's not how it works. You're the one who actually has to put the medicine in your mouth. You're the one who are actually going to have to do the regimen that you need to go through to heal yourself. And I don't get the sense that there's this great drive out there across the land to do that yet. Even after January 6th, there's a lot of chest beating and brow, raising and gnashing of teeth and concerns about this and worried about that. But what does that really mean for us as we continue on into the next cycle, where we got elections this November and then the next cycle in 2021? Do we reelect all the same people and then continue to moan and groan and whine about it? Or do we actually start that process in a way in which we start with the men and women currently serving and go, you know what, we're done. We're going to make the change, and we're going to take the medicine that we have to take. And it starts with cleaning out the thing that's actually making us sick.
And isn't part of what's making America sick a fear among some people of a multiracial democracy? I mean, if you think about what happened on January 6th, either the undercurrent or the overcurrent or the main current was, white supremacy and sort of a fear of this demographic shift that we're going to see in major ways over the next few decades. Michael Steele, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think it's at the core of it. Look, this is 419 years or 20 years in the making, right? This is not something that has just 401 years that's just showed up, on the block. We have been struggling with this issue of what America looks like for a long, long time. And we've got to reconcile in this era, in this age, how that's going to play out, because we've seen now the re-establishment of white nationalism and the KKK. Yeah, they're now dressed up not in robes with hoods, but in button-down shirts and nice slacks, and they're not afraid to walk the streets and to mingle in and be a part of the culture and the politics any longer. So we're going to have to reconcile that. The country is changing demographically. The country is changing socially, politically. And there are a lot of folks, and I still marvel at this idea, particularly among certain groups of white folks, when they sit back and they go, we want to make America great again. We want to return to what it was before. Well, what the hell exactly was that? Because even this idealized view of the 1950s, talk to the folks who lived in Appalachia at that time. Talk to the folks who lived in Mississippi at that time, white folks, right? They were just as poor then as they are now. They were just, challenged as white communities are today. So this idea that there was this great white era in America where, everybody had a picket fence except the black folks, and everybody got to go to school except the black folks, that just never existed. And so we've kind of been sold this bill of goods about what America was, when we're not even honest about what that actually was. And so how do you have that conversation today?
So Christine, Todd, Whitman, how do you have the conversation with Republicans? We talked about these proposals that are before Congress, the idea that they could be bipartisan. What do you say to your fellow Republicans who might want to stand in the way of this, might not want to get on board to some of these proposals?
Honestly, not much. No. What you try to do is remind them of what the Republican Party was about, how it was formed, and what we stood for. I mean, I grew up saying this was a party that respected the individual. And the way it respected the individual was by being less interfering in their everyday lives, not trying to be in their bedroom and tell them how they had to behave, not making these social decisions that just go far beyond anything a political party should be involved with. It also meant keeping taxes low and balancing budgets. We've totally forgotten about that. There are a lot of challenges that face this party. We were the party of the environment. I mean, the first land set aside for public land set aside was Abraham Lincoln with Yosemite. We all know what Teddy Roosevelt did with the National Park System, and it was Richard Nixon working with the Democrat Congress that gave us the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. We were a much broader party, and if we want to be a national party again, we've got to recognize that. But Michael, he brings up the right point. I don't think that, frankly, those that have really, I would say, drunk the Kool-Aid of the last administration are ready to face that. And if the Republican Party continues to be defined out of Washington, where you have newly elected House members who are part of QAnon and who believe some of those wild conspiracy theories, it's going to be very hard to redefine the party. And I know there are a lot of Republicans that are struggling with that right now. We're talking to one another saying, what do you do? We started as a third party. Do we have a third party? But to those of us that grew up with the Republican Party of principles, not a Republican Party of a certain individual, a personality cult, which is what we became over the last 4 years, I would also go back a little further. I would say that we have to, as has been said before, we have to, as Michael said, we have to look at ourselves. I mean, we got into this position, frankly, because we started taking our democracy for granted. We didn't bother to vote in primaries. Average voter primary over the last 10 years until this year was about 10 to 12% in a primary, 10 to 12%. Those are the most partisan. They tend to be the most extreme people who are giving us our chances for the fall. And so every fall you'd see a drop off. If Congress ahead of the ticket, it was 34% maybe. President, if we got 50, we thought we were doing well. This last year obviously blew everything away because people finally figured out the vote matters. But for too long, we weren't paying attention to that. And we ended up with highly partisan members, both in the House and the Senate, who have found it extremely difficult to work with one another because it's all about party. What our founding fathers warned us about. They didn't like parties. They were very afraid that exactly this would happen, that partisan politics would trump policy. And we need to understand that we have to back away from that now. There's not been a major piece of legislation, whether you're talking about Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, that has lasted, a piece of major legislation that stood the test of time that didn't have bipartisan support. Because when you do it all by one party, the next time the other party comes in, they just spend their time trying to do away with it. And we saw that with the Affordable Care Act under the Trump administration. So we have to understand that it really does matter that we talk and listen. We start to listen to one another. We can't just tell the people who are Trump supporters, still Trump supporters, that they're all crazy and bad people. They're not. They have a reason for their concerns because Congress hadn't been delivering for them, hadn't been adjusting or addressing the problems that they faced, working two jobs to stay in the same place. We're having to take on a third one because two jobs wasn't enough. These are the things that we need to address if we're going to try to get back together. And I try to talk to Republicans about that.
Michael Waldman, and I want Preet you to answer the same question. You've seen President Biden move to reverse some Trump administration policies. Some of this has been through EOs. What more do you think he should be doing? If you were advising him, what would you say?
Well, in terms of what President Biden ought to do, I think the first thing he's doing, which is focusing as hard as he is on the pandemic and the response and the vaccines, certainly makes a ton of sense. That is what the country wants. It is the mandate in a sense that he claimed. But I do think the questions for him going forward will be, how does he proceed exactly facing the challenges that that Governor Whitman and Michael Steele have identified of a very polarized and partisan political environment? Does he push forward with important legislation, even on the basis of reconciliation, which is the budget provision that can enable a bill to pass with only a majority, and on matters such as voting rights and strengthening our democracy? How can that be navigating through a very partisan environment where many Republicans just won't participate in trying to respond? Let me add one unexpected note of hope and optimism here. If you, and it can be obscured by what happened on January 6th. If you look back at this last election, it was quite a civic miracle. Despite the pandemic, the worst public health crisis in a century, in so many ways, despite the voter suppression, despite the lies, it was the highest voter turnout since 1900. 101 million people voted early or by mail. And that was because states, Democrats and Republicans all over the country took the steps they needed to take to make it possible for people to participate. Businesses and churches and civil rights groups really banded together. And it was something that suggested that outside of Washington, there is far less cement-bound polarization than you might think. This is a time of great change, demographic change and backlash, but also political change. And we could see new alliances and new possibilities coming into being.
Preet?
Yeah, just can I also add a note of optimism and paint
Please.
a slightly rosier picture than Mike? And I get everything that Michael Steele said about the impeachment, but the thing to remember also is it was 57 senators. It was a bipartisan vote, and that's not easy in this environment. And among the people who were in favor of the idea that Donald Trump incited the insurrection, has moral and legal and ethical responsibility for it, are of course the number one senator on the Republican side. He didn't vote that way, but that was the import of his statement. The number 3 House member, Liz Cheney in the Republican Party, and the standard bearer for the party in the 2012 election, the one nominee immediately preceding the twice impeached president. And then on top of that, I think the polling suggests that by a bipartisan majority, Republicans and Democrats alike, they thought that Donald Trump was responsible. So, I have some optimism that there are people who have the courage of their convictions more so than last. Somebody cynically said, at this pace, Trump could probably be convicted on impeachment trial number 4 or 5. We'll get there. But I think there is progress. And the other thing is, I think, obviously this cuts both ways. There were more Republican House members and senators who believed the same thing that the 7 senators did, but for personal, political reasons, maybe concerned for their own safety, they didn't have the courage to say it. But the fact that they think it, and a number of them did do so, and there were leaders in the party, gives you a little bit of hope, not a ton of hope. I don't want to get carried away, but a little bit of hope that some of that bravery can be unlocked over time. Now, with respect
Can
to
I just say something quickly there? You do have the Problem Solvers Caucus in both houses. It's an equal number of Republicans and Democrats in both the House and the Senate, and they are committed to working across the aisle. They are committed to getting things done, and they have been influential. And in fact, the first, I guess, bill on the COVID relief was a bipartisan and really brought forward by the Problem Solvers Caucus. So there are those who are willing. They stay beneath the radar. They, for whatever reason, didn't vote for impeachment, but they still want to get things done, and they want to do it in a bipartisan manner. So that's another good sign.
Yeah. And just to the question of what else Biden can do on the issue of law enforcement and rule of law, near and dear to my heart, not everything has to be done via policy or executive order. Sometimes the power of example is very important. And, one thing that's been very heartening is that Joe Biden has said a thing that seems kind of quaint in the election, and I think since being inaugurated, and that is he's not going to direct the Justice Department to do anything. It's not his job. It's not his Justice Department. Merrick Garland will not be his Attorney General. He'd be the Attorney General for the American people. And then you have, the nominee for the AG spot also saying, so you have two things happening. The president saying, I'm not going to be directing investigations against enemies and protecting people who are allies. And you have the Attorney General saying the same thing. And one sign of that, just imagine how it would be if the foot were on the other shoe. I mean, the shoe were on the other foot. So there's a lot of snow outside in my head, apparently. There has been a call for the resignation of all the U.S. attorneys with some exceptions. And you have a delicate situation in the state of Delaware, and the U.S. attorney in Delaware, this has been confirmed by the Justice Department, I think in some documents, is investigating impropriety on the part of Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son. Right. That U.S. attorney is not being sacked. Might seem like a small thing, but it's not, especially given the precedent of the last 4 years, where Donald Trump, if there was anything impinging on his interests, himself, his family, he said it was a witch hunt. He attacked those prosecutors and those investigators by name on Twitter repeatedly, and either tried to remove them or did remove them. So my hope is that over time, when the occasion arises on incident after incident after incident, Joe Biden stays the hell out of it, like he said he would. And I think that has a salutary effect, as the administration proceeds.
And a bit of a lightning round here. We got about 3 minutes until the Q&A. And I'll start with you, Governor Whitman. What can average Americans do to help safeguard the democracy, protect the democracy, strengthen the democracy?
First of all, they have to care. And secondly, they should support those elected officials who have been standing up for the rule of law, who have been standing up, protecting our democracy. But they have to get involved. I mean, it does come down to us. At the end of the day, it's us. We're the ones who control who's in office. We're the ones who control and send the messages to what issues we think are critical, and we need to do our part. It's as Michael Steele said, if we don't care enough, it's not going to happen.
Yeah. Michael Steele?
The three most important words in all of our founding documents are "we the people." And I think the American people need to reappreciate what that means. Our founders did not establish institutions or an individual, king or president, to be the government. They established us. They gave the power to us. So now let us be civically responsible in that regard as citizens and exercise that power with a great deal more wisdom than we have at times. Those three words are followed by, in order to form a more perfect union. Not the perfect union, not the best ever seen in the history of mankind, but acknowledging that this is a continual work in progress, and that the first part does not happen without the second, and the second certainly does not take shape without the first. So I think connecting those dots, not just historically, but principally in this hour for us as citizens, is how we begin to heal, to address a lot of the concerns that the governor and Preet and Michael have put on the table before us, so that we can be a more perfect union.
And Preet, what about you? Advice?
I think people need to use not only their vote, but also their voice. I echo the things that the others have said. There were occasions, even during the Trump administration, when some things were done that were so odious that so many people used their voice and marched and made hay about it, not to minimize it, that there was a change in policy. And most notably, I think, the separation of children from their families at the southern border. You know, it does work. And the second thing I'll say is there's this concern that now that Trump is out of mind and he's out of sight and he's off Twitter and the impeachment trial is over, that people will go back to their regular lives and they'll binge watch TV shows. Mm-hmm. I think some of that is good and healthy, because who wants to think about politics 24 hours a day? But another note of optimism, I think enough Americans have been awakened to the idea that their democracy is fragile and that their voice matters, and that the vote certainly matters, as Michael Waldman pointed out, with respect to the amount of people who voted, that they're not going to go away, that they've been activated as citizens, and there's still a lot left to fix and to right the ship. And Donald Trump, or some other demagogue on the left, who has bad policies, not just bad policies, but bad practices, and is unprincipled, and is trying to pull the wool over the eyes of the American people. That can happen on either side. And it takes active, engaged citizens who have, I think, been awakened over the last 4 years to continue that process towards righting the ship. And so I hope they'll continue to be engaged.
Michael?
I echo what all my colleagues said. It's exactly right that history teaches that it isn't always the first demagogue, the first authoritarian figure who comes and succeeds. We have to be aware of the risk of a smarter Trump. Although I guess after this week, Ted Cruz no longer would qualify for the smarter category based on what he's done in the last couple of days, ignoring the suffering of the people in his own state. But that's a risk not only here, but all over the world. There's an assault on democracy that we see in Europe, in Asia, in all parts of the world. We're part of a great global struggle for this thing that we care about so much. And I would say that we need to be militantly in defense of the Constitution and of the principles of the Declaration of Independence, and stay with it, and not decide that the danger has passed, because we have something to fight for.
Great. So we're going to we got some great audience questions, and I'm going to go to you on this one, Christine, Todd Whitman. Can any needed democracy reform at the federal level get past the filibuster? And this is a hot topic, is it actually time to just get rid of the filibuster altogether?
Well, obviously that is being argued vociferously right now in the Senate. The problem with doing away with the filibuster is that the next time around, people are, when this when things shift, they're going to want it back again. And it's a way to try to slow things down, not to necessarily stop things. Again, we had a number of recommendations in the report of inside baseball things that can be done to allow the Congress to function better. I mean, right now, one of the problems that they have is that leadership has such huge control. For instance, even if you had a bipartisan group of, say, 50 congresspeople who wanted a piece of legislation brought forward, unless the leadership said yes, it doesn't get to the floor. So it gets very frustrating for new members who have new ideas, who want to do new things, who want to see reform, because they can't get there. So we need to look at how the Congress itself, not we, they need to look at how they regulate themselves before we can start to see any real bipartisanship. And unfortunately, after what happened on the 6th and in response to it, it seems that in many ways, the partisanship has hardened and people have gotten they've gotten nastier, frankly, with one another. And that's a real concern. But as for the filibuster itself, that's one thing that we've gone back and forth on, and it depends on which side of it you're on at the particular moment, whether you like it or you don't like it.
Right.
But it hasn't always been abused. It was not put in as a tool for abuse. It was put in as a tool for allowing people to slow down, have time to consider an issue. And again, if you have the right rules in the House or the Senate, you can still bring an issue to the floor eventually.
Michael, I'm going to go to you on this one. Michael Steele, how does the Republican Party regroup and go forward after January 6th and its follow-up? Is the two-party system at risk if the Republican Party is weakened? And if so, what problems does that present for our democracy?
To the first part, hell if I know. I was inside the crazy, and there were days where I was like shaking my head going, who are these people? Seriously though, that's going to be a dynamic question that's going to get played out. We've now seen just in the last 24 hours, former President Trump now reemerging vocally on the scene and engaging Mitt Romney with some pretty nasty names. Story out today saying that, his people, even those who are with him still, are telling him, this fight with McConnell is not going to be a good fight. It's not good for you. It's not good for him. And Trump's response is, yes, but it's good for my ratings. So that's the rub for the GOP. You have latched on to a reality TV series that does not want to end. The star does not want to hang up, the series and move on. So that's going to be an internal battle amongst those of us like Christine and myself and others who will continue to stand for and articulate those Lincoln-esque principles that drew us into the party. And that's going to be a fight that's going to take some time, and it will probably get bloody, to be honest about it. Meaning, as we've already seen, state parties are, censoring members who took principle stands. This was the party that always argued, stand for principle. Well, they took a principle stand, and now you want to censure them. That's the kind of blood on the floor politically I think we're going to see more of going forward. But that's necessary, Nia, to sort of clean out this system one way or the other. The second part, real quick, we need a viable political system. I'm not going to say two-party, because I've always been an advocate for the growth of the political system by allowing more political voices to participate and to play. Our founders, as much as they did not want political parties, what we have found is the system is designed not to really allow for proliferation of such. So we've got to, as citizens, reconcile that truth. If we want this system as a whole to remain viable, let's expand it, and let's allow more voices to participate in it, and let's be the appropriate check on each other when it comes to, okay, who's going to govern the country?
And so we are in a divided country here, and I imagine the country has in some ways always been divided, and you have people who saw the prosecution of Donald Trump as completely partisan and partial. People who voted for Donald Trump, they feel like they don't have any confidence or trust in the system. Preet, how do you bring those people inside and make them believe again in the system, in the rule of law, in facts?
I guess to plagiarize from my co-panelist Michael Steele, hell if I know. It's really hard. Look, I've been thinking about this, and I haven't written on it, but people's faith in the justice system is shaken in a very serious way and in a broad-based way with respect to how Black and brown people are treated by law enforcement. That's different from this.
Right.
The vast majority of garden variety cases brought against public figures, and I oversaw and authorized a lot of them when I was U.S. Attorney in New York. There's some, complaining, and there's some, statements of witch hunt. But if you're doing it in good faith, you can prosecute and hold accountable a governor, a senator, a chairman of a committee. The top two legislative leaders in New York were prosecuted and convicted by my office. There's something different in the DNA of people who are supportive of a sitting president or a nominee for president, that supporters will find fault with anyone who tries to hold them accountable. You had to lock her up with respect to Hillary Clinton, and you have some of that with respect to the defense of Donald Trump, and quite frankly, early on, some of the people who said Donald Trump should be locked up without having looked at the evidence, depending on what the issue was. But the number of cases that involve literally the leader of the party seeking the presidency, who gained the presidency, is a tiny, 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 tiny fraction. And so, I don't know how you convince those people, whether it's by impeachment in Congress or an investigation. I think you just have to make as much effort as possible, like I suggested Joe Biden is, that politics stay out of it. You don't use political rhetoric, et cetera, et cetera. And then the last point I'll make is, which is not a legal point, that I think it was Anna Applebaum made on my podcast, upcoming podcast episode, that sometimes when you have political disputes on a particular issue, like was Donald Trump railroaded in impeachment, you change the subject a little bit. And you think about other stuff that the sides will agree on, COVID relief, infrastructure, and you try to shift the conversation to things that everyone can happily be in favor of, or at least, have reasonable debate about, rather than be polarized over, because it becomes a game of you hate my guy, I hate your guy. So combination of those things, I think, will help over the long term.
And Michael Waldman, I'm going to go to you on this one. What impact can reforms have without a fairness doctrine in national media? How can people begin to trust any institution when they can access major media that adheres to their biases, telling them the government is incompetent at best and out to get them at worst?
Well, it's such an interesting question, of course, this week when Rush Limbaugh passed away. In that the Fairness Doctrine was, for a time, a legal doctrine that the federal government enforced, that there needed to be both sides or all sides put forward in the broadcast media, and that there had to be equal time. And it was repealed by the Reagan administration in 1987. I think, truthfully, the Supreme Court probably would have found it unconstitutional had they not done that. And it's a very hard thing to see something like that come back, given the profusion of new technologies. It's not just broadcast licenses, cable television, or the internet, or social media. I think that grappling with the incredibly revolutionary effect of technological change in the media is something we've all just begun to do. I think that we've seen important accountability and public demands of the social media platforms, for example, to take seriously their own responsibility in promulgating fake news and promulgating hate and racism. There needs to be more of that kind of thing. There needs to be a serious look by Congress and policymakers at the regulation of social media. Both President Trump and President Biden called for the repeal of Section 230, which is the kind of governing doctrine about the internet. I don't know that that's going to happen, but this is one of those times where we all cherish and love in so many ways what social media, what the internet has brought, but we're seeing very directly a lot of the really negative consequences too. And that's another time of reform and of accountability that comes. But I guess I'll say I'm not entirely sure what the answer is on this one either, other than being relentlessly putting forward facts and truth as an antidote to the fake news.
And Christine, two questions for you. One of which is people want to know where they can get the report of the task force that's led by you and Preet.
Oh, that's easy. Go to the Brennan Center.
Okay.
We did it at NYU. It was published under that, and it's there. You can get it. Yes, I have my copies here too.
Okay. We can go online.
We're shameless in promotion, but only because everybody on the committee was really committed. It was a bipartisan, nonpartisan commission, and they really cared. And we had one member who decided that she couldn't continue to participate only because she didn't have the time to give it the attention that it needed. So this was it's a pretty thoughtful document. And of course, the Brennan Center wrote most of it with input from the rest of us.
I want to ask you, Christine, and Michael, so maybe you can weigh in on this too. I feel like when you watch cable news, it seems like people like you, Christine, Todd, Whitman, and Michael Steele, that you are kind of the Republican Party. You're certainly trying to reclaim it. But is the Republican Party now more the party of like somebody like Jim Jordan than you? Like, what percentage of Republicans do you think are like you, Christine, Todd, Whitman, and like Michael Steele? Is it 10, 15%? What's your sense?
Well, it's the real issue here is that who identifies as a Republican, because if you look at what's been happening to the registration numbers, the Republican Party's been losing registration. It's been going to the independents. And those are people, I believe, like Michael, you and I, who just were not into the cult of personality of Donald Trump. He did not represent the party that we knew and that we supported throughout our lives. And so that's the real issue here. The people who self-identify tend to be the ones, as Republicans, who are still Republicans, are the ones that were comfortable with what happened over the last 4 years. And again, I get back to the thing that rankles me the most, because I think a lot of those people were just so angry at the fact that Congress had been so dysfunctional and wasn't focusing on their needs and wasn't answering the issues that they saw every day in their everyday lives, not the higher income people, but the middle income and lower income people who were really struggling, that they wanted someone who would do something. They didn't care what he did, just do it. And whatever else you say about Donald Trump, he did a lot of things. Now, there have been nothing we liked or got us to a bad place, but he was doing things. And that's what they saw, and that's what they want to continue to see. So, I think they're more quote unquote Republicans, or people who have been Republicans who have now moved to the independent column. Certainly, I know hosts of them, and people reach out all the time and say, I'm just not there. I'm not a Democrat. AOC scares me. I'm not an Elizabeth Warren AOC person, but I'm certainly not a Donald Trump person. And so they have nowhere to go right now. And they're looking for an answer and a place to put themselves, but they're not Republican, and the party will not. I'd have to change the title of my book. It's not my party too anymore, the way the party itself is described.
And Michael Steele, we talked a bit about the kind of racial division and the racial problems at the root, or the racial fear at the root of what happened on January 6th. How do you convince Republicans that multiracial democracy is actually a good thing for them? And white Republicans who do seem to have this anxiety about the fact that I think it's by 2045, white people will be less than 50% of the population.
Well, losing will play a big role in that. When you start losing elections, reality has a way of hitting you upside the head. Look, I have been a county chairman, a state chairman, national chairman, an elected official, an activist in the party for a very, very long time. The one thing I always paid attention to when I was in those leadership roles, particularly as a party official, were the trend lines. And I remember meeting with a lot of the Republicans here in the DMV, District, Maryland, and Virginia, particularly in the Virginia side, saying, y'all better watch what's happening in Northern Virginia. because Virginia, remember the 1990s was a big red state. It was like the creme de la creme of redness across the country. It's one of the bluest in the country right now because of those demographic shifts that took place in its exurbs and in its suburban regions outside of Washington. Look at what's happened, the trend line again. We've gone from Virginia to North Carolina to now Georgia. Let me repeat, we lost Georgia, all right? And then in play will be South Carolina. That race with Jamie Harrison was a hell of a lot closer than it should have been, right? South Carolina. And here's my prediction. Texas will be a battleground state in 2024. And my prediction is Republicans lose Texas in 2024. Because we're not paying attention to how the country's changing.
But Michael, you can weigh in on this quickly. I mean, Republicans are doing everything they can, from gerrymandering to putting in new voting restrictions to make sure what Michael Steele is predicting doesn't happen.
Yes, the reaction of the Republican Party in many respects is to look at the changing country and try to restrict democracy and restrict the voice. We're about to start the redistricting cycle or the gerrymandering cycle. Most of the demographic growth in the southern and southwestern states comes from communities of color who have every right to have their voice heard. And there's a real risk with the Supreme Court having gutted the Voting Rights Act that we'll see gerrymandering. Again, I think that all of these issues will be the fight of the next decade. And we'll look back in the future at a time like this and see that the country recreated itself once again, I hope along the lines of our core values and our core civic institutions to reflect the country as it actually is and is becoming.
We're going to have to close there. Thank you so much on behalf of myself and the audience. Thank you, Preet Bharara, Michael Steele, Michael Waldman, and Christine Todd Whitman for this important discussion. And thank you to the New York Public Library for hosting this fantastic event. And thank you to the Brennan Center. And you can get the report there that we were talking about, the task force on the rule of law and democracy, for their tremendous work on this important issue. Special thanks to the Brennan Center's Dan Weiner and Martha Kinsella for their work in supporting today's event. Most importantly, thank you to the audience. We really appreciate you for attending. Thanks so much.
Thank you for joining us for this program. On screen, there is a closing slide with the logos for Live from NYPL and the Brennan Center for Justice, NYU Law.